Hi there. My name is Gideon Rose, and I'm here with a sneak preview of our July-August issue, Foreign Affairs. We just had a really blockbuster May-June issue called The New Arab Revolt. And among the issues it touched on was volatility in the Middle East and the implications for things including energy prices. One of our big pieces in July-August will be a look at why oil markets are going to be more volatile than ever in the months and years to come. And I'm here today with Mike Levi, one of the chief authors of that piece, to discuss it. So, Mike, why will oil prices and oil markets be more volatile than ever going forward?
The question you need to ask is, why have oil markets not been so volatile in the past? If you look back over the history of oil markets, they've generally been pretty calm. There have been exceptions, 1970s, the latter part of the last decade, a period after World War I. But for the most part, there's been a big producer that always stepped in to stabilize prices. Today, we don't have that producer playing that role. As of the middle of the last decade, Saudi Arabia basically conceded that role, and that means that prices have to swing far to balance supply and demand.
So if you had increasing demand, steady or not especially growing supply, and a swing producer who has increasingly less flexibility, that's the recipe for volatility going forward?
Basically, look through history. If you start in the early 20th century, Standard Oil, John Rockefeller's trust, controls the market and stabilizes prices. They lose control after the Supreme Court breaks that up, and you have a period of volatility. Then there are big oil discoveries in Texas, and you have, again, Texas stepping in to stabilize markets, and then a sort of U.S., Saudi, Middle East connection stabilizing prices up until the 1970s. Then you have, again, this breakdown. There's a lot of volatility in the markets through the 70s, and then once again OPEC gets together and is able to move supply in order to match supply and demand in the short term. But then in the middle of the last decade, what happens is the Iraq War comes along. Saudi Arabia responds in order to balance the market by increasing supply. But once the war dies away, that old spare capacity doesn't come back.
Why not?
It doesn't come back for a few reasons. I think this is a case where there are a host of things pushing in the same direction. So first, it's just difficult to push additional barrels of oil out of the ground. We tend to focus on the amount of oil in the ground. There are huge amounts of oil in the ground in Saudi Arabia, but we often don't focus as much on how much you can produce at once. On top of it, it's really expensive to hold on to a lot of spare capacity, which is what you need to do. You put the infrastructure in place, you spend up front, so that then you can move production in the short term. But that means you have to spend a lot of money and sometimes not use that production capacity. That causes problems. On top of all of it, Saudi Arabia has been keeping oil in reserve and swinging production in order to stabilize prices, in part as part of an alliance with the United States going back a long time into the Cold War. The relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has become considerably weaker in the last decade, and so the incentive for Saudi Arabia to provide that stability has declined.
And do the Saudis themselves have to pay more to keep their domestic coalitions in harmony?
Saudi Arabia has pressures coming from inside. It needs more money in order to spend at home, but it can do that by producing more oil or keeping the actual price higher. Fundamentally, that doesn't need to force it to not be a swing producer. It's when all of these things come together, and particularly when on top of all these economic pressures, that strategic rationale is gone, that things become a lot harder. On top of all of this, it's relatively easy to plan to be this swing producer when markets are relatively predictable. So when you had in the past most growth coming from the developed world at a predictable pace, you had production coming up again at a predictable rate from OECD countries and from non-OPEC countries. It was relatively easy to plan. Now you have this growth in Asia that's extremely hard to predict. You have oil supply in countries that are very uncertain, whether it's Nigeria, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq. It's very hard to plan to have just the right amount of oil. It's very easy to get that wrong, and if you get it wrong and you have too much on the market, prices crash, and if you have too little, they spike.
What about drill, baby, drill? Is increasing American domestic production a part of the answer to this?
It's certainly part of the answer. What you want in particular is predictability on the supply front. If you have big shifts in the expected supply, there isn't as much capacity in the market to react and balance things out. So in the medium term, every extra barrel does matter, but it's not going to fundamentally transform the situation for you.
What about things like natural gas? We hear all about the emergence of shale gas and other kinds of untraditional gas reserves coming online. Is that going to be part of the thing that will help matters stabilize?
The first application for shale gas is going to be in the power sector and maybe in industry. And the big question is, how far does it get into transportation? Because right now our transportation fleet is only set up to use oil. It's barely set up to use natural gas. And it costs a lot of money in order to make a big transition to natural gas, whether that's in building plants that convert gas into fuel or building vehicles that use gas as fuel. And people need to be confident that gas prices will stay pretty low for a pretty long time before they make those big upfront investments. So if gas prices stay low for a long time, then we'll see a bigger transition. If government steps in a big way, we could see a bigger transition. But as far as getting us out of this pickle in, let's say, the next 5 years or even 10 years, I think it's hard to see gas being a fundamental change.
Is this a partisan issue? Is this something that there's a where you stand depends on where you sit on?
When you look out of the world, it's kind of like that. One of the nice things about this article is I'm writing it together with Bob McNally, who was special assistant to the president in the George W. Bush White House, focused on international energy. And when we look out at what's happening in the world, we basically see the same thing. We see the same physical situation in the market, the same changes in relationships, the same potential implications for economics and for geopolitics. And even when it comes to a lot of the solutions, when we look at supply, I'm sure we differ on the margins, but we have a generally similar outlook. When we look at helping people deal with volatility, which is a key part of what we talk about, you can't banish this, so you need to give people the tools to deal with it, we tend to come out similarly. And one of the more interesting things when it comes to the recommendations is we also think that giving people incentives to cut down on oil consumption in the context of deficit reform might be able to include things like gas taxes that have been politically toxic in the past, and where there might be actually more agreement between the two sides than on something like income taxes or payroll taxes.
A world with volatile oil markets, just one of the things you'll learn about in the July-August issue of Foreign Affairs. We've got a blockbuster lineup of pieces on economics and energy and competitiveness coming forward. We have Nobel Prize winner Michael Spence on economic inequality and the new shape of global employment. We have economist Alan Taylor. We have budget analyst Peter Orszag, the former head of the CBO, on the true costs of healthcare reform. We have Stephen Ratner, the car czar, talking about what America can learn from Germany in terms of competitiveness. Whole lot of great stuff coming your way in July, August in Foreign Affairs.